In business news this week, 3 things to know. First, pitfall. US stocks take a deep dive, dropping by 315 points as oil prices continue to slide, making it the worst week this year for the Dow and S&P 500. Then, deep divide. Why the wealth divide between minorities and whites is the widest it's been in more than a decade. And kid tested and approved. How companies are relying on pint-sized inspectors to help stack shelves this holiday season and why it's paying off big. Arise Exchange starts now. Hi, I'm Akhtar Khan in for vacationing Andrew Schmertz. Big shake-up for the US markets as the Dow and the S&P had its worst showing this week for the year and its biggest weekly drop in 2.5 years. All eyes on oil prices. They continue to slide to lows, causing much concern for investors. We'll have a lot more on this story in just a moment. But first, we go to the budget battle brewing in D.C. And the wheeling and the dealing continues in Washington after the White House, the House narrowly approved the spending bill Thursday night, despite a disconnect between liberals and conservatives. The bill now sits in the Senate as lawmakers work desperately to avoid a government shutdown. Now, Arise Washington Chief Bureau James Blue joins us now with more. James, thanks for joining us on the program. Let's go straight to it. Lots of back and forth between the Democrats and the House. What's been going on there? They didn't vote with the Republicans and they did vote with the Republicans. What did that happen?
Well, basically, I think what's happened is that everyone's recognized that the country really can't sustain another shutdown. And so both Democrats and Republicans sort of came together to pass the bill. There's still some very disgruntled members of the House, largely the very liberal members and the very conservative members. The conservatives wanted to gut the Obama immigration efforts, and the liberals are not very happy with the easing of regulations on banks, and they're not very happy with the raising of campaign finance limits. But everyone wants to get something accomplished, and that's why the center won and people moved.
Now, Obama intervened as well after the second vote, if you like, after the first vote. But why did he intervene? Was it unusual for him to do so? And did the Democrats vote again with Republicans because of his backing of the bill?
Well, I think President Obama did give some cover to some of the Democrats who ended up supporting the bill. Again, the president has enraged many members of Congress with his immigration action. He wants to sort of minimize that conflict. He knows that the next Congress, the 114th, is going to be much more adversarial. Republicans will control both the House and the Senate. And he just wants to sort of show that they can get things accomplished despite the fact that there's real divides between the parties up on the Hill.
So what does the $1.1 trillion actually mean then for the federal government, actually mean for the GOP, obviously take over control of the House next year?
What it really means, and I think this is very important, it means that the numbers that the government will be spending between now and 2016 is fixed. They know how much money that they are, well, when they get a deal, when the Senate has to approve, they know how much money each department is going to get. So, for example, Ash Carter, who's taking over at the Pentagon, the budget for the Pentagon and for the wars that we're fighting is already set. And so the real sort of work trying to determine the policy really becomes the focus. There's really no further fight over the amount and budget, and the real fight can go to what should we be doing with this money.
Okay, James, very quickly, I did actually want to talk about this, but we didn't mention this earlier on. There's been a change in terms of contribution as well, from $100,000 now. Single donors can donate $800,000. Is that part of the bill as well? And what's the reaction to that from the Democrats?
Well, the Democrats are really upset because, traditionally the Republican Party has had a much larger group of large donors. And so there's some sense that this provision will sort of tip the political advantage to the Republican Party. They certainly did much better than Democrats during the midterms, although with someone like Hillary Clinton, who has a lot of support on Wall Street, maybe it will be less important.
Okay, James, we must leave it there. Thanks very much indeed, James Blue, joining us there as our DC correspondent. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Now, as we mentioned earlier, the markets were rattled as oil prices continue to fall dramatically. Here's a look at the final numbers and major losses across the board. The Dow lost 315 points to close at 17,280. The S&P 500 down more than 1.5% to 2,002. And the Nasdaq ended the day down 4,653. And here's how stocks performed over the week as well. The Dow dropped almost 4% off record highs in the recent weeks. The S&P 500 lost 3.5%, and the Nasdaq lost more than 2.5%. And the top stocks we're watching today is Google, closing up shop on its engineering office in Russia. The company is reportedly leaving the country after a crackdown on websites that store personal data. Google closing there. MetLife board has approved a buyback of $1 billion of its common stock. The company is preparing rather for new rules after federal regulators deem the company systematically important. MetLife closing there just down 52.84. Now, SeaWorld announced it will replace CEO Jim Atchison effective January the 15th. The change is a part of a major restructuring to deal with dwindling audiences after a documentary criticized SeaWorld's treatment of animals. SeaWorld closing there at 15.78, down just 31 cents. And now for a look at commodities. Gold closing at 1,222.20 an ounce, and oil dropping down again to 57.65 per barrel. Well, some major economic figures also released. Consumer sentiment for December rose to 93.8, hitting an 8-year high. And producer prices for November fell 0.2%, driven by plunging oil prices. Now, the falling price of oil continues to dominate the headlines this week, and now more concern as the price of crude drops below $59 a barrel. The International Energy Agency cut its outlook for crude demand growth in 2015. This follows the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries cutting its demand to the lowest level in more than a decade. Well, Michael Lear is the Vice President of Portfolio Management at Athena. Michael, thanks for joining us here on the program. Good to see you again.
Good to see you.
Let's get straight to it. What's happening with the price of oil? Why is it dropping so much? Is it because of the news coming out of Russia and China in terms of productivity?
Well, that's part of the story, but I think what's important to note is what we've seen in the original part of the drawdown is that there was a lot of supply side. So OPEC said they were going to stay online, continue to produce despite the drop in oil prices. Now what we've seen as of this morning is the demand dropping. So that's further concerning, and that's probably the reason for the more recent drop.
Well, Saudi Arabia and Kuwait said they were going to step in and increase production. Has that happened? That clearly hasn't affected the price of oil, though, has it?
Not yet, but I mean, people are always looking forward, and I think that's affected the price.
What about the U.S. consumer? It's benefiting the U.S. consumer, though, at the end of the day. They're jolly as they can be.
Well, it's not as jolly as it would be in the past, but I think in terms of the consumer's pockets, it's about, I think by most estimates, about $750 to about $1,250 benefit to U.S. consumers. The flip side of that is, as U.S. has become a larger producer of oil, some of the downturn in oil does affect us.
Let's look at the market overall in that case, how the market's generally reacted. We've seen the vast drop there in the close today. How the market's generally reacted overall, and certainly in terms of the forecast?
In terms of the forecast for oil, I think it does have an effect. I mean, obviously, there's large components of the S&P that are tied to oil, so it's generally going to have an effect on large caps. But I think more broadly, as we look forward, that impact is going to be lessened as people get adjusted to the new price.
Let's talk about the price. How much further can it go?
I don't have a crystal ball, I couldn't tell you. But in my conversations with our managers who work in those spaces, it could fall dramatically lower. I mean, I've heard some estimates around 45. Not that I buy into any of that, but I think what people need to be cognizant of is the long-term effects of what's going on right now. So people are taking production offline now, and that will eventually lead to higher prices.
What about the small oil producers here in the U.S.? That's going to affect them dramatically, isn't it? Yeah,
I mean, it's hard to imagine, but out there we do have some marginal producers, some mom and pop shops that are probably going to be forced out if this is a significant long-term decline. It's going to have lesser effect on larger companies that have lower levels of debt, that were able to hedge, that were kind of doing the right things in terms of their individual corporations. So, I mean, it's definitely going to have dramatic effects for some, but I think, overall, those effects are going to be muted.
Well, let's talk about one of those companies. Halliburton, for example, laid off 1,000 people as a direct result of the oil price change.
Yeah, I mean, and it's sad to see, and nobody wants to see anybody put out of work, especially at this point in the economy. But that's one of the effects of lower prices. People in those industries are going to be forced out of work. but it's a larger benefit to the overall economy, and I think that's what people need to focus on.
Okay, let's look at the volatility of the economy. Has it been volatile of late? Why is that? Have we just seen it sort of, if you like, those peaks being ironed out?
Oh, it's funny that you mentioned the volatility, because the volatility has been so low for so long that people just now are freaking out about, we're just getting back to normalization. So in terms of record keeping, I guess you can say we haven't had a downturn of over 10% since 2012. We've gone the entire year without having four or more straight down days in the Dow, the S&P. So what does that mean? These are statistical anomalies that really shouldn't exist. So we, as managers, it's been hard to put money to work, just because there hasn't been a significant downturn that we were predicting coming in the year.
Okay, Michael, we must leave it there. Thanks so much for joining us. Thank you.
Thanks.
Good to see you. Well, coming up, the fight to destroy deadly superbugs and the cost to keep it going. You're watching Rise Exchange.
There is a reason Africa is called the new frontier. What was once potential is now an opportunity ready to be seized. Once revered for our resources, today's wealth lies in our people. People who build the cities that shape the future. People who know an idea in one place means business in another. A generation for whom technology means there are no borders, no boundaries. We are the new lions in a brave new world, kings of the urban jungle. And there's a bank that puts the world in our pocket and the future in our hands. UBA, Africa's global bank.
Well, welcome back to Rise Exchange. Now, the statistics are alarming to say the least, and of course, a shocking new report from the British government says the number of antibiotic-resistant infections around the world is increasing each year. About 50,000 people die from drug-resistant superbugs in the US and Europe, and the number could rise dramatically, killing an additional 10 million people a year and cost up to $100 trillion by 2050 if these superbugs are not stopped. Now, Jeff Krwas is a drug industry expert and the CEO of Crystal Research Associates. Welcome to the program. Thank you for joining us. $100 trillion sounds like an awful lot of money.
It's a lot of money. I mean, when you take a look at the worldwide domestic product was 74 trillion. When you take the U.S., China, and Germany combined, it's 30 trillion. I think 110 trillion is excessive as far as the estimate.
So where does that figure come from in that case?
Well, they've tried to estimate lost production, lost economic value, the increased costs of the medical system. To put things in perspective, the United States Centers for Disease Control estimate that the AMR, the antimicrobial resistant drugs in the United States, cost an additional $20 billion to the healthcare system and $35 billion in lost wages. So $55 billion in the United States is a far cry from 110 trillion. So to put that in perspective, 16.6 trillion is the GDP of the United States.
It puts it into perspective a little bit. So what kind of superbugs are we talking about? Let's just clarify that.
We're talking about drugs that are resistant to antibiotics. And these drugs basically can spread, and any antibiotic you give them certainly causes no effect. So it's not that there isn't a problem. There is a major problem that's killing 23,000 people in the United States, as you mentioned, 50,000 U.S. and Europe combined. But to think that the pharmaceutical companies, the biotech companies are not going to do anything about it, they will. They're going to use MES technology, ERP technology. They're going to streamline. They're going to get more efficient. There's a lot of biotech companies working on super drugs right now for the microbial resistant products, and there's device companies doing it as well. We expect that the pharma industry and biotech, while the numbers have dwindled from the companies working on it, because a pharma company wants to have a drug that you take every day, not a drug that you take every day for 2 weeks, but they are not going to let this go unnoticed. And certainly the fact that the superbugs have made their way into the food supply is a major problem also.
Well, if antibiotics are rising on the increase in that case, then of course then the number of antibiotics is also falling in terms of its use. So there's a slight discorrelation there.
Totally. And what has happened is there's only been 4 new antibiotics basically approved in the last 10 or 12 years because there hasn't been incentive for the pharmaceutical industry. Meanwhile, drugs continue to the bugs continue to mutate themselves and become more antibiotic resistant. Doctors continue just to prescribe antibiotics in excess, making the next time you get an infection, infection, maybe you're resistant to the antibiotics. So it's got to be a change in the attitude of the consumer, a change in the attitude of the doctor, and certainly you saw the Obama administration put the GAIN Act through. They know that this is a problem. It's not going to go unignored. I'm not saying it's not a significant problem. It is, but I am saying pharma and the medical industry and biotech and device companies will respond.
Okay, Jeff, very finally, which countries are the hardest hit? We mentioned the US and Europe. We talked about these two, but
obviously Africa, Brazil, India, China, any of the countries that are growing that don't have very sophisticated medical systems right now. And the other thing I would keep in mind is this report was put out there as an estimate for 20 in 2050. So we've got 36 years to get there, and I'm confident that the number of drugs in development will increase.
Let's hope so. Jeff, we must leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you. Ahead, the race for wealth equality, or in this case, inequality, why people of color are being left behind and struggling to catch up to their Caucasian counterparts. All that and much more here on the Rise Exchange.
If I was building my own network, it would be for the people, by the people. It would be very diverse. It would be with every culture you can think of.
If I was to start my own news network, it would reflect positive and negative within the continents and the countries around the world.
I think that I would be more looking towards young people.
If I were to build my own news network, it would look like New York City. Old, young, fresh, hip, classic.
If I was to build my own news network, I would just have people from all over who are very connected and diverse.
If I was to build my own news network, my own world network, I would love a correspondent in every country, every location, every city. I mean, it's kind of unrealistic, but how cool would it be to get local stories from the impoverished country, the impoverished city that we don't know about?
Arise News, every culture, every angle.
Informative. The U.S. economy is on the right path, and the wizard of the Fed is leading the way.
We started our companies originally to create something that made a positive difference.
Compelling.
I became very successful, not allowing myself to be average.
Our favorite person of the day, when we pick one person who grabbed our attention, and not for the right reason. Yeah, he sort of lost all business. Investors came back from the long weekend, tanned, rested, and ready to buy stocks. Entertaining money daily, a Rise Exchange.
Welcome back. Now, the U.S. economy is gaining steam, on track to making a full recovery. But for some Americans, rises in wealth have been minimal or nothing at all. Whites have 13 times the net worth of blacks, the largest wealth gap in more than 2 decades. Net worth for African-American households dropped to $11,000 in 2013, while white household median wealth ticked up to about $142,000. Now, some experts say the widening wealth gap is undermining economic growth by creating a less educated workforce. Well, joining us now to tell us more is Mike Cassidy for Century Foundation's Policy Associate. Mike, thanks very much for joining us here on the programme. Let's get straight to it. What do we know? 2014 into 2015. Exactly. Why such a disparity?
Well, I think there's lots of factors at play. I think that when you see what we have today is something that's been going on for quite a while. These new numbers aren't really surprising to people who've been following these trends.
But it's quite dramatic, though, 11,000 to 142,000?
Right, it's quite a dramatic divide, but when you consider there's a lot of factors that go into this. For example, whites are much more likely than blacks to own homes. They're much more likely to own investments and
Why
stocks.
is that? Is that a cultural thing more than anything else?
I don't think that it's a cultural thing. I think there's a socioeconomic divide in the country that happens to be highly correlated with race. And so what you see is that upper income people of all types are much more likely to own investments than are less well-to-do people, and those trends coincide with race. And so what we see is that when the stock market, bounces back in the face of the recession, it's grown remarkably over the last couple of years, the last week notwithstanding, you'll see that the investments rise, wealth among whites goes up, whereas those who maybe had to take out their investments during the downturn to make up for losing a job or didn't have investments to begin with are stagnating.
Just how much is education a factor? Because if you think about the more educated, they tend to go for higher, better paid jobs the more educated they are. How much does education play as a factor?
Yeah, education certainly plays a role. I mean, we see that blacks are more likely to attend worse schools than whites and at the same time perform worse while they're there. Now, again, it's not to say that that's because of race. It's to say that these schools are in disadvantaged neighborhoods. They might not have the same resources in their communities and their families to be able to support their education. And we know that education is the best path to a more prosperous future.
Now, I was reading some of the statistics from I think it was the Pew Research Center. It said that in the last 30 years, the net worth of white American households is around 100,000 rather, or between 6 to 8% higher than net worth of blacks.
Sure.
Once again, another damning statistic.
Yeah. Again, you see that these trends have been around for quite some time, and where it begins is really in childhood. You see that kids that grow up poor are more likely to have trouble in terms of their education, in terms of the jobs that they get. Another study from Pew, which is interesting, shows that 4 in 10 Americans who grow up in the lowest income quintile stay there as adults. Less than 7 in 10 make it to the middle class, and in fact, only 1 in 20 will make it to the top. Now, that's not even a racial divide, that's a socioeconomic divide, but when you factor in that 65% of blacks will actually begin life in that lowest quintile, you see that, much like the graphic you had on screen before, it's really like if you think about your local 5K race, if all the blacks had stand and wait for the whites to leave 5 minutes earlier, and you have that staggered start, it's quite a disadvantage. And we would never take that on the athletic field, and it's kind of amazing that we allow things like this to go on in the economy as well.
Well, some people will say we have an African American in the White House. Why is this still happening?
Sure. Well, obviously, certain people can succeed, but Barack Obama, happened to. It's an anecdote. It doesn't really describe the typical.
But it's gotten worse over his presidency, hasn't it? If anything, he just happens to have been president at the time, but the gap has widened.
Yeah. The gap has widened in the last couple of years in terms of wealth. I mean, we see it propagate everywhere, but wealth is probably the most problematic because we see that the intergenerational transmission of poverty happens because if you're a white and you have a trust fund handed off to you, it's much easier to make it than if you have nothing handed to you along the way. There's much less margin of error, and when things get difficult, it's hard to move on from there.
Is there any outlook in terms of investment and consumer spending and investment trends from blacks here who tend to want to do something different than their fathers did or forefathers did? Is that trend changing?
I think when we move towards maybe like behavioral nudges to see policies that you're automatically enrolled in a 401k plan by your employer rather than having to opt into it. Those are small changes that can get people to be more proactive in terms of their investment. But I think, again, it really starts to creating a more level playing field from the beginning. One of the things that I study is unemployment, and what we see with the unemployment statistics, for example, is that blacks are twice as likely to be unemployed as whites. Then we control for race, we control for age, we control for occupation, we control for education, we control for where people live, and we see that the gap is still twice as large. So this is an issue that even if you take away the other factors, there's still discrimination, there's still prejudice in our society, and those are factors that we really have to work on.
Well, I'm actually quite surprised by the report, I have to say, but Mike, we must leave it there. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Appreciate it. Well, Toy Story, why kids are a big asset to toy makers this season. We'll have that story when we return.
I believe that people are watching news less today, definitely. I think that more so people are going online to catch their news.
We've numbed the human mind to murders and all these bad things.
The content is a constant loop of the same stuff. So there needs to be, new content all the time.
Arise News, every culture, every angle.
Informative. The U.S. economy is on the right path, and the wizard of the Fed is leading the way.
We started our companies originally to create something that made a positive difference.
Compelling.
I became very successful, not allowing myself to be average.
Our favorite person of the day, when we pick one person who grabbed our attention, and not for the right reason. Yeah, he sort of lost all business. Investors came back from the long weekend, tanned, rested, and ready to buy stocks. Entertaining money daily, Arise Xchange.
Welcome back now. More than $22 billion are spent each year on toys in this country, with a significant portion of that spent during the holiday shopping season. Toy manufacturers are now using a tiny tool to get the best products on the shelf, and the end user, the kids. And they're hiring kids to review and test toys, and experts say it's very beneficial to companies and consumers alike. Well, Laurie Schacht is the CEO of Toy Book, and she joins us now to tell us a little bit more about this. So what's going on? I feel like Tom Hanks and Big.
Well, yeah, that is my job. I am like Tom Hanks and Big. But, you know, I have a full editorial team. We're reviewing toys all year long. That's what our job is. We put out guides for consumers.
When you say we, who else is in your team?
We is my team of experts. We go to every toy show. We started looking at toys for 2015 back in October. So we've already started the process for next holiday season.
So you have kids working for you as well?
Well, we do have our Toy Insider Kids, as we call them. So, and that goes to the point that we're going to talk about with kids in videos, because even we recognize the importance of bringing kids into the process. Toy companies are making products for children, so of course it makes sense that kids want to see what other kids like. It's kind of word of mouth, except now it's happening on places like YouTube. And we have these mini stars emerging.
With huge amounts of success. Tell me a little bit about that.
So, you know, the question becomes, now that the toy companies are paying these tiny tots.
Huge amounts of money.
Huge amounts of money. You know, what's the impact?
What sort of sums are we talking about?
Well, you know, I don't know. They haven't really been very forthcoming, and they don't have to be. But you know that there's a lot of money involved when parents start quitting their jobs and getting involved in the game with their children.
6 or 7 figures, I understand.
So, yeah, you know, you look at someone like Evan Tube. He's a kid. The family got involved. They're making millions from what I understand, but a lot of that is coming from ad revenue. You know, so the question is, first, kids do want to see kids unboxing and demoing and seeing what's going on. So, you know, the fact that the toy companies are recognizing how important these children are, I think is a good thing. And the question is going to be, where do we draw that line? If it's impartial, if they're simply saying, here's this item, showing it within the box, unwrapping it, showing the contents of the box, and not giving an opinion on the toy if they're getting paid, you know, that's okay. Because that's what kids are watching, and toy companies realize it. And I guess if kids are going to spend their time, and it is a lot of time that they're spending making these videos, it's like any other job. Somebody wants to get paid, right?
Oh, somebody does want to get paid. Absolutely right. Well, let's think about the look on a kid's face when he opens or she opens this present is very different from being paid and to do a wow as opposed to wow. You know, there's a huge difference. So kids relate to kids. And
Kids do relate to kids. So, you know, we have our Toy Insider Kids, and we do demo videos with children. We do them with our experts, and, you know, I do it, my editorial team does it, but we do have children that we work with. We don't pay them. What we do is we send them toys in advance of the videotaping. We ask them when they come to video, tell us your name, and tell us about the toy. Say your name, the name of the toy, and tell us about the toy. Sometimes the kids love it, sometimes they don't. And they're very honest about those opinions. They get to keep the toys.
They get to keep the toys. Very important this time of year, especially. Very important. Let's talk about why it's taken so long, do you think, for toy companies? Or how long has this been going on for?
Well, it's been going on for a while. Really, it's about 6 years that it's been growing. The paying the kids is really relatively new. And, you know, YouTube hasn't been around that long. So what you're seeing is people learning how to use the different platforms of social media in different ways. This one has become a great platform for children. I mean, and little kids are watching other little kids, and then they're finding other channels that have the same toy. So, you know, it's still relatively new.
Now, obviously, children speak to other children, speak their language, and of course, as you've mentioned, adults tend to manipulate what could potentially go out on these YouTube. But there is a huge difference between a child really being excited about something that he or she really enjoys, and being manipulated by, I guess, YouTube or any other company.
Right. And it's a tough one to answer. It's a tough call because the kids are really making an impact online. But you don't want them to be swayed because now there are dollars involved.
Well, the companies must be making an awful lot of money, very finely, because clearly if the kids have been paying, as I understand, 6 or 7 figures, then the toy company must make a huge amount. Laurie, listen, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Fascinating story, my favourite story of the day. Thank you. Good to meet you. Well, next week on Rise Exchange, the boom of the biotech industry and how this sector is helping to strengthen the US stock market. And now for another look at those markets, red arrows across the boards. The Dow lost 315 points to close at 17,280. The S&P 500 down to 2002, and the Nasdaq ended at 4,653. I'm Akhtar Khan, standing in for Andrew Schmertz, who will be back on Monday. Thanks for watching Rise Exchange. Have a great weekend.